Good morning, and welcome to this week's edition of Midweek Money Matters, brought to you by the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities. Today, we're going to be talking about New Year's resolutions and how we can create and stick to our financial resolutions by using a budget. We are recording today's session. We will stop the recording at the end and invite anybody who wants to ask questions to ask them live, or you can type them into the chat box and I will answer them as I am able. So let's go ahead and get started. I was fascinated to learn as I was starting to research for today's session that almost 75% of Americans are planning to set some form of New Year's resolution for 2021. That's actually up from years past, but I think that in the face of everything that we've been facing, that's not necessarily a surprise. And spending more time with family, being more intentional about learning, saving more money, making a budget, planning for future goals are all resolutions that are not that uncommon. If you're anything like me, you have planned to have a resolution many years, and it's not always easy to stick to them. Today's session, we're really hoping to be able to focus on how we can make small changes so that we're able to stick to our budgets throughout the coming year for our resolutions. Now, I thought this was interesting that not only are 75% of us planning to make a New Year's resolution, but half of those resolutions involve some form of finance, whether we're trying to save more money for an emergency fund or a wedding or whatever, or maybe we're trying to pay off debt. That's a huge resolution for a lot of people. And that's a great thing to do, but we have to have a plan in order to help us get to that place. And so that's where we're really going to focus during today's session. So we want to start the new year off right, being able to stick to our resolution. If we use a budget to help us reach those goals, that can really help us to get there. So today we're going to cover why we need a budget. We'll talk about setting SMART goals. And there's an acronym that we can sort of keep in mind as we start to work towards those goals. We'll talk about how we can use the budget to reach those goals, because it's one thing just to, arbitrarily have this goal, but what's my plan to get there? And that's where the budget really can come in handy. And then we'll talk about finding the right budget tools that can help us to reach those goals. But before that, I really am curious what your opinions are on budgeting. So I'm just going to open a quick poll, and I would appreciate anyone who's participating today to just go ahead and tell me what your opinions on budgeting are. Whether you think that budgets are a bad word, you certainly wouldn't be alone in that. Um, but, maybe you're one of those who doesn't necessarily think you need a budget. Or maybe you're like my dad, who had a budget for years, but was always looking for some other way. Um, so, go ahead and just tell me here what your thoughts are on a budget, and we can move forward. We'll just wait another 5 or 10 seconds and see if we have any additional answers. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and move on. If we use a budget so that we can regularly sort of make this plan, about what we're going to do with the money that we have coming in, it can help us to plan so that we can meet those financial goals that we're looking to reach. So I often have people ask me, where do I start? So it's a really good idea to, when you're starting to set financial goals, you want to make sure that it's not some pie in the sky. I'd like to save $1 million by the end of 2021. I mean, that would be great. But on a civil servant salary, it's probably not going to happen. So we want to make sure that the goal is specific, but it also has to be achievable. So yeah, it would be great for me to say I'd like to save $1 million, but that's probably not achievable when I make much less than that every year. So it has to be measurable, and that's where the M comes in. For me to be able to say that I want to go on a vacation sometime this year, that's great, but is it really that measurable? If I say I want to go on vacation to see my brother in Tennessee in July, that's measurable. It's also reasonable. So if we take a look at, how do we start to reach these financial goals? We can set SMART goals, which is, it's specific. Is my goal measurable? Is it achievable? Again, that $1 million by the end of the year, not necessarily achievable or reasonable. It's certainly timely, right? It puts that time frame in there, but that still doesn't meet the criteria for being a SMART goal. But if we go back to my my example of a vacation to Tennessee, that actually meets all of those different criteria. It's specific because that's where I want to go, is Tennessee. It's measurable because I want to do it for the 4th of July. It's achievable because, it's probably, since I'll be staying with my brother, it's going to cost me, my transportation, meals, and, if I want to do anything while I'm in Tennessee. Definitely achievable and reasonable. And again, I've set out that I want to do it for 4th of July. That's timely. So that it goes a long way in helping me to sort of outline a plan, because we talked about the fact that we really do need a plan in order to reach those goals. So that definitely meets those criteria. So maybe you are still working on identifying those priorities. Whether your priority is to get that emergency fund saved up, or whether you're planning to simply pay your bills on time. That is definitely a goal that some individuals really need to work hard for. And that's okay. Again, we can set those goals, make sure they meet those SMART criteria, and, start to make that plan that we can do that. Paying down debt is another huge priority that many of us have. However, if I say that I want to be debt free by the end of the year, I have to make that plan in order to be able to do that. So one of the things that I like to suggest is, once you have figured out what your priority is, so maybe your priority is to establish that emergency fund. I like to use that one because it meets all of that SMART criteria that we talked about, and it is much less broad than maybe paying down debt. Paying down debt is a huge priority for many of us, but we have to actually take the time to identify what that is. So paying down debt is definitely a priority, but to identify which debt we want to pay down first actually goes even further, so that we can identify, so that we can make it actually happen. So once you've identified the priority, and we're going to stick with setting up that emergency fund. So if we look at the SMART goals, I want to have by the end of June, so that gives me 6 full months, I want to have $500 saved in my emergency fund. Now that meets all of those criteria for SMART goals, right? Whoops. It's specific, it's measurable, it's in my 6-month time frame. Is it achievable? Well, if you actually take $500 and divide it by 6 months, it comes to not quite $84 a month. Now, if you get paid twice a month, you can break it down further and set aside $42 every pay period, and that can go towards your emergency fund. So if we look at that, is that reasonable? For some people, it may not be. And if that's the case for you, then maybe you want to go back to the start, and maybe you want to set a smaller goal for, instead of $500 by June, what about $300 by June? Then I have to save $25 every 2 weeks if I get paid that often. So each one of us has a different reasonable criteria. But that's okay. It's up to each individual. So let's go back to, we've looked at the time frame. If we divide that cost by the time, again, if we go back to $500 by the end of 6 months, we come up with that almost $84. That's what you need to save on a monthly basis in order to hit that goal. If that's not feasible for you, again, adjust that goal so that it is something that's achievable. And then finally, set up the account and make it happen on a regular basis. My husband and I have 2 daughters, and they were so kind, they decided that they both were getting married within about a year of each other. And I hadn't, at that point, really started to focus on saving money for weddings because I was busy raising kids, and doing other things. So when it dawned on me that I better have a plan to be able to help these girls with their weddings, I had to go back to that SMART goal and decide what it was I could comfortably, or maybe not so comfortably, be able to set aside to help my daughters. And so my husband and I did that, and it was really cool. It ended up being, we had enough time that we both decided that we would set $50 from every pay aside for this wedding account. So we set up the account, and initially we had to adjust some spending, and we'll talk about that when we start to really get into budgets, but we had to kind of adjust some spending. But the reality was, after a couple of pays, I actually didn't even notice that I was missing that $50 every pay period. And my husband had the same thought process. So what was really cool is, as my kids, the girls got married and they did their thing, and we took the money from that account and gave it to the girls, we decided that we would keep saving that money, that same basically $200 a month was going into this account. And we decided that to celebrate the fact that we were able to achieve that goal, we were going to continue to save so that we could take a vacation. We had a group of friends that were planning to go on a cruise like 18 months out. And so we continued to put that money into that account, and it changed from the wedding account, it changed to our vacation account. And so we really recognized that having that account automatically scheduled um, to automatically transfer funds from one account to the other on the day that we got paid helped us to achieve those goals. So, you know, as you're starting to set these goals and you figure out your 4 steps, how much is it going to cost? What do you need to deposit and actually make it happen into that account? Once you reach that goal, you can actually really start to celebrate. Now, before my husband and I could determine whether or not we could save that $50 every pay period, we actually had to sit down and think about what our budget was. And so we realized that there are tons of different tools out there that are available. Whether you are a tech person and you want to download an app to your smart device, whether you want to have a piece of paper with your budget written out on it, or whether you're somewhere in between, there are tons of different tools out there. We just have to figure out what works for us and we have to use it. I was telling the session last night with my dad always had this canvas covered ledger, and I can still picture it today. It was this really cool kind of green color. But when you opened it up, you could actually see his budget outlines from year to year to year. And he kept track. He listed all of the bills that he had to pay, and he listed how much they were, and he always listed the date that he paid them. So it actually kind of worked as a way for him to reconcile to ensure that all of his bills were paid every month. But it also gave him the ability, in this ledger, he was able to actually look back and see that where expenses had changed over the years, and he could see where he needed to adjust for different items. When my brother and I were much younger, he could get away with spending much less money on groceries because, well, he needed more money for diapers or whatever the situation was. But he found the tool that worked for him. And so I would encourage you to do the same. Make sure that you have that goal, that tool that's going to work for you. Now, as I said, if you are a tech person, there's an app for everything, right? So before you start just simply downloading whatever app you find, it's important for us to understand some different things that we need to consider before we simply download the first app that we find. We want to know if the app is secure. And if it's not, step back to think about whether it needs to be. If all I'm doing is keeping track of numbers, it may not need to be secure. However, if I'm paying my bills from my app, or my account information is stored on the app for any of my bills, then it definitely needs to be secure. And that opens up a whole different can of worms. However, if it doesn't need to be, then, maybe we're okay with using an app that's not secure. But we also want to think about, can we access reports? A report that I think is really cool is one that shows me how well I've stuck to my budget. So if I've allocated $300 a month for groceries, and I can keep track of that in my app and keep track of how much I've actually spent, being able to pull a report so that I see exactly what I've spent and how much I plan to spend is a really cool report, because I can give myself a huge pat on the back when I stick to my goal or my budget. So that's something that you want to take a look at. And also, ease of setup. Can it be shared with a spouse? My son actually got married this year, and him and his wife are exploring different apps that they can share together in order to be able to hold each other accountable and stick to their budget. So those are some things that we kind of need to think about before we just simply go into, just downloading whatever app we find first. We want to make sure that we also check the reviews for the app. Make sure that you're downloading it from your device's app store, not some random application that you just find and try to download. Downloading directly from your app store helps to ensure that the app that you're using is credible. And then you can also take a look at reviews from other people who have used that application. So make sure that you do those things. Now, the reality is that getting started, it really can be sort of this easy as 1, 2, 3 for us to do. So we can evaluate what we've done historically. We can then prioritize what our goals are. And then, what can we expect from having this budget in place? Are we expecting that it's going to be easy for us to reach to make our budget work? Or is it something that's going to be a challenge? And, challenging ourselves to spend less money is okay. We just have to make sure that we understand what that expectation is at that time. So what I think is really cool is, we kind of had that list of priorities earlier on in today's session. As we reach that goal, we can check that off and we can focus on what the next goal is. So if my goal was to pay down debt, and whether you choose to, there are lots of different ways that you can choose to pay down debt. And the reality is, I don't know that any of them are right or wrong. They're just different. And we don't have a lot of time to go into the differences in that thought process. But maybe you decide to pay off your smallest debt first. So you can make that happen within a couple of months. Then you can focus on your next debt that you want to pay down. And so you can put all of your focus into paying that until you get that one done. And that's the way that you can work down that list of your priorities, whatever they may be. But maybe you want to make bigger changes. Completing a spending log is a really cool way to actually see where your money goes. So a spending log requires that you record every penny that you spend for at least 30 days. Most professionals suggest that you do it for a minimum of 60 days so that you can really see what your habits are. But, sometimes it's easier to get started with just a 30-day. You record every penny that you spend and you give it a category, whether it's for living expense, for housing, utilities, entertainment, insurance, whatever that category falls into, look at that, and then you can determine if you have leaks, where you're spending money that you didn't necessarily realize you were spending. I know for me, when I did this initially, I went and I did that. I created my spending log, and I was amazed at the amount of money that I was spending at convenience stores because I was on the road all the time. So you stop at the convenience store, you need gas, you got to go to the restroom, whatever. But you stop and you buy a bottle of water, a soda or iced tea because you need some caffeine, but you also want a snack, but you can't decide between salty or sweet, so you buy them all, and suddenly you spent $10 or $15, where if I would have gone to the grocery store, that $10 or $15 would have been enough for me to get through the week. Well, if you multiply, 3 or 4 times a week, or even 5 times a week, that really added up. And I was amazed at the amount of money that I was basically leaking to, the convenience of being able to grab it and go. So I actually bought cases or 12 packs of soda. I bought cases of water, and I bought regular sized bags of my snacks, and I put them into smaller bags so that I could still manage the portion control. But that actually ended up freeing up significant amounts of money that I could use for my other priorities. And that went a long way in helping me to reach those goals of helping the daughters to get married. So once you've done that, maybe you want to think about adjusting so that you can better meet some of those other goals. If we go back to the emergency fund, if I can spend a little bit less on entertainment, that might free up $10 or $20 that I can add to what I'm already putting into my emergency fund, and it can help me reach the goal that I've set sooner. Whether that is maybe you want to pay more towards debt. Again, adjusting some of those other more flexible items in our budget can help us to focus on the things that are important to us. And, if we go back to the very beginning where we talked about having those goals, what our New Year's resolutions are, cutting and paying in other areas can really help us to stick to those resolutions. So that's, I think, important for us to consider. Like I said, once you've hit that first goal, that feels really good, doesn't it? So now I want to reevaluate what's going to be the next goal. And I can really feed off of the excitement of having met my first goals or my second goals, so that I can focus on making the next goal happen. And that really helps us with this sort of staying excited and helping us to reach those goals and ready for the next challenge, which can really help us to get that emergency fund saved. It can help us, whatever our next goals are, whether it's planning a vacation, or saving for someone's college education, or even saving for your future retirement. Again,